Ethan was used to driving through heavy snowstorms. Living in Alaska made that inevitable. But this particular night felt different. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snow was so thick it swallowed the headlights of his truck. He was on a desolate road, heading home from his night shift, when he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. A figure stood in the middle of the road, barely visible through the snow. Ethan slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop just inches away. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, his breath turning to mist. "Hey, you okay?" he called. The figure was wearing tattered clothes, barely suited for the deadly cold. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes, they were black, empty voids. The man didn't respond. He simply smiled, revealing teeth that looked sharp, like icicles. Ethan's gut screamed at him to run. He jumped back into his truck, locked the doors, and floored the gas. The truck roared to life, but as he passed the man, he heard a sickening thump on the roof. Something was on top of his truck. Heart pounding, Ethan kept driving, refusing to stop, even when he heard scratching sounds above him. He didn't stop until he reached his cabin, practically diving inside and locking the doors. He peeked through the window, expecting to see the man outside. Nothing. But as he turned away, he heard it. Slow, deliberate knocking on the back door. The storm raged outside, but inside, Ethan felt something much colder creeping into his bones. Lena loved winter hikes, even when the temperatures dropped far below freezing. Growing up in Montana, she had always found peace in the quiet stillness of the snow-covered forests. But one December evening, she discovered that some things should never be disturbed. She had been hiking alone for hours, following a familiar trail through the woods. As the sun began to set, she noticed something strange. Her footprints weren't the only ones on the trail. Another set of prints ran parallel to hers, slightly behind, as if someone had been following her. She stopped and looked around, but the forest was silent. No movement. Just the eerie whisper of the wind through the trees. Brushing it off as paranoia, Lena continued walking until she heard it. A crunch in the snow. Someone or something was nearby. She turned her head slowly and saw a shadow standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. Its face was hidden in darkness, but she could feel its gaze on her. Lena's heart pounded as she picked up her pace, but no matter how fast she walked, the shadow stayed with her, weaving between the trees, moving soundlessly. Then, the forest opened up to a clearing, and she saw something that made her stomach drop. The footprints, they didn't start anywhere. They just appeared out of nowhere, following her path. She ran. She didn't stop until she reached her cabin, locking the door behind her, gasping for air. For a moment, she thought she was safe, until she looked at the frost-covered window and saw a long, thin hand pressed against the glass. It was the coldest night of the year when Daniel, a paramedic in a small town in Minnesota, received a chilling emergency call. A lone driver had reported seeing a body frozen in the snow just off an old, abandoned road near the woods. With temperatures dropping to deadly levels, every second mattered. Daniel and his partner, Mark, arrived at the location quickly. The area was desolate, the trees heavy with ice. Sure enough, there it was, a figure lying motionless in the snow, partially covered by the wind-blown drifts. They rushed over, kneeling beside the body. It was a man, his skin pale blue, lips frozen in a grimace. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. The disturbing part? His clothes were thin, completely unsuited for the brutal cold. "This guy didn't just collapse here," Mark muttered. "He wasn't dressed for this at all." Daniel reached out to check for any signs of life, though he knew it was hopeless. But the second his fingers brushed the man's ice-cold skin, a horrifying thing happened. The body gasped. Both men stumbled backward as the frozen corpse let out a shallow, ragged breath. Its fingers twitched. The skin, though frozen solid, cracked as the body began to move. Then, it sat up. The sound of ice breaking filled the silent night as the corpse turned its head toward them. A slow, unnatural grin spread across its frost-bitten face. Daniel grabbed Mark's arm. "Get back to the truck. Now! They sprinted, slipping on the ice, barely making it inside before Daniel slammed the doors shut. From the rearview mirror, he saw the man slowly rising to his feet. And then he started walking toward them. Daniel floored the gas, speeding away as fast as the icy road allowed. The next day, police arrived at the scene to investigate. But there was no body, only the deep, dragging footprints in the snow, leading into the woods. Marcus and his friend Joel had been snowmobiling in the remote mountains of Colorado when a sudden blizzard trapped them in the wilderness. The storm was brutal, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Their only hope was to find shelter before the cold claimed them. After what felt like hours of wandering through knee-deep snow, they spotted a cabin nestled among the trees. It was old, its wooden walls weathered and dark, but the windows glowed warmly with light. Relief flooded them as they stumbled toward it. Joel knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin was cozy. Too cozy. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. A kettle of water steamed on the stove. There were no signs of anyone living there, yet the place felt occupied. Maybe a ranger's cabin, Marcus suggested, shutting the door behind them. Maybe, Joel muttered, uneasy. But why would someone leave a fire burning? They sat by the fire, warming their frozen fingers, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up their spines. Then, Marcus noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow outside. Not theirs, not anyone else's. His stomach tightened. "We should go," he whispered. Joel nodded, suddenly just as unsettled. They stood to leave when the front door slammed shut on its own. Then the fire went out. The room plunged into darkness. The air grew icy, and a low whisper filled the cabin, coming from everywhere at once. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight and aimed it at the door. And that's when they saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing in the corners, in the shadows, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty. The whispering grew louder, turning into an unintelligible chorus of voices. Marcus didn't wait to understand. He grabbed Joel, yanked the door open, and they bolted into the snowstorm, running blindly through the freezing wind. They didn't stop until they reached a ranger's outpost the next morning. When they told the ranger about the cabin, he frowned. "There's no cabin up there. Hasn't been one in over 50 years, Marcus and Joel insisted. They had been there. They had seen it. The ranger shook his head. That old cabin burned down in 1972. 2 hikers froze to death inside when the fire mysteriously went out. Neither Marcus nor Joel ever spoke of it again. But sometimes, on cold, snowy nights, Marcus swears he still hears the whispering. Ryan was a long-haul truck driver, used to lonely winter nights on the road. One freezing night, he was driving through a remote stretch of highway in North Dakota when he spotted something unusual in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, waving for help. He slowed down and saw it was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned coat, her dark hair covered in frost. Her pale face was desperate. "Please," she begged as he rolled down the window. "I need a ride. My car broke down." Ryan hesitated. Picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere wasn't usually a good idea. But the temperature was deadly, and she looked half frozen. He unlocked the door. She climbed in, shivering. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so scared." Ryan nodded and pulled back onto the road. They drove in silence for a while. Then he tried to make conversation. "So, where were you headed?" She didn't answer. He glanced at her. She was staring out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Something about her unsettled him. A few miles later, he spoke again. "Is there someone you want me to call when we reach town?" Again, silence. Then she turned to him, her lips trembling. "You should have left me there." Ryan's hands tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean?" She slowly raised her hand and pointed to the windshield. Ryan looked up, and his blood ran cold. A car was in the middle of the road, its lights off, nearly invisible in the snow. He slammed the brakes, barely managing to swerve around it. His truck skidded to a stop on the icy shoulder. Heart pounding, he looked back. The car was totaled, its front smashed against a tree. It had clearly been there for a long time. Snow piled over the hood, the windshield cracked, and inside, he saw her, the same woman, frozen in the driver's seat, her lifeless eyes staring straight ahead. Ryan whipped around in his cab, but the seat beside him was empty. The door had never even opened. He left the scene in a panic, driving straight to the nearest police station. When he told them what he saw, the officer paled. "That accident happened last winter," the officer said. "That woman, she didn't make it." Ryan never drove that road again, but some nights, when the snow is heavy, truckers still report seeing a woman on the roadside, waving for help. Jack was a seasoned ice fisherman, used to the bitter cold of the Alaskan wilderness. He had spent years fishing alone on frozen lakes, enjoying the solitude. But after one terrifying night, he never went out on the ice again. It started as a normal evening. He set up his fishing shack in the middle of the frozen lake, drilling a hole in the thick ice. The wind howled outside, but inside his small wooden hut, the lantern cast a warm glow. Hours passed, and he caught nothing. Then, the noises began. A faint tapping from beneath the ice, rhythmic, almost like knocking. Jack frowned, thinking it was shifting ice, but then it came again, stronger, closer. Curious, he grabbed his flashlight and peered into the hole. The water was black, bottomless. He saw nothing, until something moved. A shape deep below the surface. Not a fish, not anything he recognized. It was massive, and it was rising. Jack scrambled back as an impossibly long, pale hand, human-like but wrong, reached up from the darkness, its fingers too many, too thin, stretching toward the surface. The ice beneath him groaned, cracking. Jack grabbed his gear and bolted for the shore, his boots slipping on the frozen surface. Behind him, he heard it, scraping, something dragging itself beneath the ice, following him. He didn't stop running until he reached his cabin, locking the door and collapsing by the fire. His heart pounded as he stared out the window, expecting to see something. But there was only the storm, only the endless, frozen lake. The next morning, he returned to pack up his gear. His fishing shack was gone. The ice where he had been sitting had shattered. A gaping black hole remained. Whatever was down there had finally broken through. Jason loved skiing in the Rockies, especially at night. The slopes were empty, the world silent except for the sound of snow crunching beneath his skis. But one night, he learned that not everything in the mountains was alone. The moon was bright, casting eerie shadows across the untouched snow. He had taken a secluded trail, one he knew well, winding through dense pine trees. The cold air burned his lungs as he glided downhill. Then, he saw the skier, a figure dressed in all white, moving effortlessly through the snow ahead of him. No sound, no trail left behind. Jason frowned. No one else was supposed to be out here. He pushed forward, trying to catch up, but no matter how fast he went, the skier remained just out of reach. Then, the figure stopped. Jason slowed, his breath visible in the freezing air. The skier stood completely still in the middle of the path, their back to him. "Hey, you okay?" Jason called. No response. The skier's head tilted slightly as if listening. Then, without turning around, they moved again, gliding into the trees. Jason hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He followed. The trees grew thicker, the path narrowing. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he kept going. Then he saw them, ski tracks in the snow, dozens of them. But they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. His stomach tightened. The wind howled through the trees, and suddenly he heard it. Whispers. Faint, almost like the wind. Then, behind him, crunch. A ski scraping against the snow. Jason spun around. The skier stood inches away, face obscured by an old, frost-covered mask. Jason stumbled back, only to feel his skis slipping. The snow beneath him had vanished. He was falling. The next morning, ski patrol found his gear scattered near an old, abandoned trail. But Jason was never found. Some say on cold, moonlit nights, a new skier can be seen on the slopes, gliding silently through the trees. In the winter of 1998, Mark and his wife, Lisa, were driving through the mountains of Vermont when a brutal snowstorm forced them to stop. Visibility was nearly zero, and the roads were too dangerous to continue. Just as panic set in, they spotted an old roadside hotel, a 3-story building with warm, glowing windows, and a faded sign that read, "Blackwood Inn." Relieved, they pulled into the empty lot and rushed inside. The lobby was elegant but old-fashioned, like something out of the early 1900s. A man in a formal suit stood behind the desk, smiling warmly. "Welcome," he said. "You're just in time. We have one room left." He handed them an antique key, and they climbed the creaky staircase to the second floor. Their room was beautiful but strange. No television, no phone, just a heavy wooden bed and a large mirror above the dresser. The storm raged outside, but inside the hotel was silent. Too silent. In the middle of the night, Lisa woke up. She nudged Mark. "Do you hear that?" A faint sound echoed through the hallway, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Mark got up and peeked outside. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued. Then a voice. Software. Almost a whisper. "Why did you come here?" Mark slammed the door and locked it. The next morning, they hurried downstairs, eager to leave. But the lobby was different. The fireplace was cold. The desk was covered in dust. The grand chandelier hung in pieces, shattered on the floor. No lights, no warmth, no sign of the friendly man from the night before. Panicked, they ran outside, only to find their car buried in decades of snow. And when they turned back to the building, the Blackwood Inn was nothing but ruins. A collapsed structure, long abandoned. Tom was driving home from a late shift when the snowstorm hit. The roads were barely visible, his headlights illuminating nothing but swirling white. His tires skidded occasionally, forcing him to slow down. Then, in the distance, he saw something, a figure standing by the roadside, a woman. She was dressed in an old, tattered coat, her long hair covered in snow. She didn't wave or signal for help, just stood there staring. Something about her sent a chill down Tom's spine, but he couldn't just leave her in the freezing cold. He pulled over and rolled down his window. "Do you need a ride?" Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her face was pale, her lips almost blue. Without a word, she opened the door and got in. Tom swallowed hard. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer. The silence was suffocating. He focused on the road, trying to ignore the icy sensation creeping through the car. Minutes passed. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Her breath wasn't fogging up the window. His hands tightened on the wheel. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Tom's blood ran cold. He turned to look at her. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door had never opened. The only proof she had ever been there was a single wet footprint on the floor. Terrified, Tom pressed the gas, speeding toward home. The next day, he told his friend about the encounter. The man's face went pale. "There's an old legend," he said. "A woman died on that road years ago during a blizzard. People say she still waits for someone to take her home." Tom never drove that road alone again. But sometimes on snowy nights, drivers still report seeing her, standing silently by the roadside, waiting for her next ride. Ethan and his friends, Jake and Lauren, had planned a weekend getaway in a secluded mountain cabin. It was supposed to be a fun, cozy trip, until they found the faces in the ice. The first night, the storm rolled in hard, trapping them inside. The wind howled, shaking the windows, but inside the fire crackled warmly. They played cards, drank hot cocoa, and laughed, ignoring the blizzard outside. Until Lauren screamed. She was staring at the window, her face pale. "There's someone outside!" Ethan and Jake rushed over, but saw nothing. Just the snow-covered trees and the darkness beyond. "You probably saw the reflection," Jake said, trying to calm her. Lauren hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, maybe." They went to bed, but in the middle of the night, Ethan woke up. Something was tapping on the window. He sat up, his breath visible in the cold air. Slowly, he turned to look. and his heart stopped. Outside, faces were frozen in the ice, dozens of them pressed against the glass, eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, their expressions twisted in horror. He stumbled back, shaking Jake and Lauren awake. Look! Look at the window! But when they turned, the faces were gone. The next morning, they debated leaving, but the storm had blocked the roads. They were stuck. That night, the temperature dropped even lower. Ethan refused to sleep, keeping an eye on the window. Around 2 a.m., the whispers started, faint, garbled, coming from outside. He forced himself to look. The faces had returned, but now they were inside the glass. He screamed, waking the others. Lauren took one look and bolted for the door, only to stop dead. The front door was wide open. Snow had blown inside, covering the floor. Footprints, wet, bare footprints, led from the door to their beds. They left that night, storm or not. A week later, Ethan searched for any history of the cabin. He found an old newspaper article. Decades ago, a group of travelers had gotten lost in a blizzard near that very spot. They froze to death. Their bodies were never found, but their faces still remain, trapped in the ice, waiting for the next visitor.